What if a billion-dollar deal, the fate of an entire company, didn't hinge on a slick presentation or a ruthless negotiation? Imagine a table in one of New York's most exclusive restaurants. On one side, powerful executives sweat under the pressure. On the other, a Japanese millionaire, silent and unreadable, holds all the cards. The air is thick with tension and the stench of failure. But what nobody at that table knows is that the key to unlocking a fortune, to bridging an impossible cultural divide, isn't in a briefcase. It's in the hands of the waitress, clearing their plates, a woman they never even bothered to look at. The air inside Aurelia was not merely conditioned, it was curated. Each molecule seemed polished, carrying the faint, expensive scent of aged leather truffle oil and quiet, generational wealth. Sunlight, tamed and filtered through triple-paned tinted windows, fell in soft, apologetic rectangles upon the thick aubergine carpet, refusing to be so gauche as to glare. This was not a restaurant. It was a sanctuary for the titans of industry, a silent battlefield where fortunes were won and lost over plates of seared scallops and glasses of vintage Bordeaux. Tonight, Table 12 was the epicenter of a conflict more fraught than any in recent memory. Seated on one side were the hopeful conquerors from Innovate Dynamics, a tech firm teetering on the edge of global dominance or spectacular collapse. At the head of their delegation was Richard Sterling, a man whose tailored suit seemed to be woven from pure, unadulterated ambition. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his jaw was perpetually set in a state of aggressive readiness, and his blue eyes scanned the room, not with appreciation, but with the predatory gaze of a hawk assessing its territory. To him, Aurelia was just another boardroom, the fine china, simply a more delicate type of ammunition. Flanking him were his lieutenants, Ethan Hayes, young and eager, his face a mask of nervous sycophancy. He laughed a fraction of a second too early at Richard's non-jokes and nodded with an intensity that bordered on desperate. Ethan's entire future was tethered to this deal. Across from him sat Olivia Grant, sharp, analytical, and possessing a stillness that Richard often mistook for timidity. While Richard saw spreadsheets and market share, Olivia saw people patterns and the subtle, often invisible currents of human interaction that could capsize even the most meticulously planned venture. She felt the curated air of the room not as a comfort, but as a suffocating presence. The object of their collective anxiety, the man who held the fate of their 10,000 employees in his hands, was Kenji Tanaka. He was a legend, a ghost in the machine of global finance. His conglomerate, the Tanaka Corporation, was a sprawling empire of technology, manufacturing and artistry built from the ashes of post-war Japan into a behemoth. Yet the man himself was an enigma. He was small, impeccably dressed in a simple dark suit that likely cost more than Ethan's car, and his face was a placid lake, betraying no ripple of emotion. His eyes, dark and deeply set, seemed to absorb the light around him, reflecting nothing back. He had not spoken a single word of English since his arrival. His only communication came through his aide, Mr. Saito, a man who seemed carved from granite, his posture ramrod straight, his expression impassive. Saito's translations were brief, clipped, and devoid of any nuance, turning the already tense atmosphere into a vacuum. This dinner was the culmination of 6 agonizing months of long-distance negotiations, legal wrangling, and logistical nightmares. The deal was a merger, an acquisition. The specific term depended on who was speaking. For Innovate Dynamics, it was a lifeline, an infusion of capital and access to the Asian market that would make them untouchable. For Tanaka, his motives were like the man himself, inscrutable. Moving between the tables, a phantom in a crisp black uniform, was Clara Rossi. To the patrons of Aurelia, she was part of the decor, a functional entity who appeared with water and disappeared with empty plates. Her movements were fluid and economical, born of years spent navigating crowded, high-pressure environments. At 29, her life was a world away from the gilded cage she served. It was a life of 2 jobs, of taking extra shifts to help her younger brother through college of late-night bus rides, back to a tiny apartment in Queens that smelled of her neighbors' cooking. But Clara carried a secret history within her. Her grandmother, a woman she had adored, was a second-generation Japanese immigrant who had filled Clara's childhood with stories of the old country, with the aroma of green tea and the complex, beautiful cadences of her native tongue. She had taught Clara the language not in a classroom, but in a kitchen folding gyoza and tending to a small, resilient bonsai tree on their fire escape. It was a language of proverbs of respect, of subtle honorifics that could change the entire meaning of a sentence. It was a language Clara hadn't spoken regularly in years, but one that was etched into her very soul. As she approached table 12 to refill their water glasses, she felt the tension radiating from it like heat from asphalt. She saw the forced rictus-like smiles of the Americans. She saw the rigid posture of Mr. Sato, and she saw the profound, almost melancholic stillness of Mr. Tanaka. He wasn't just sitting, he was observing, absorbing, and judging. And in his eyes, Clara saw something none of the executives could: a deep, unbridgeable loneliness. She poured the water, her hands steady her presence, unnoticed, a silent witness to a conversation where everything was being said and nothing was being understood. The first course had yet to arrive, but she already knew this dinner was going to be a disaster. The appetizer arrived, a delicate tower of tuna tartar with avocado mousse and a yuzu dressing a dish designed to be as much a work of art as a culinary experience. Richard Sterling saw it as his opening. Mr. Tanaka, he began, his voice a little too loud in the hushed room, forcing a jovial tone that landed with a thud. This dish, a perfect fusion, wouldn't you say? Japanese inspiration, Western execution. Much like our proposed partnership, the best of both worlds coming together to create something stronger. He beamed, clearly proud of the metaphor. Ethan Hayes nodded vigorously, a small, excellent point, Richard escaping his lips. Olivia Grant subtly cringed, taking a small, precise bite of the tartare. Mr. Saito leaned toward Mr. Tanaka, murmured a few words in Japanese, his tone flat and uninspired. Clara, standing near a service station a few feet away folding napkins, caught the translation. Saito had reduced Richard's flowery business poetry to a blunt, sterile phrase. He says this dish is like our partnership. All the intended charm, the strategic flattery, was stripped away, leaving only the clumsy, arrogant core. Mr. Tanaka picked up his fork, not chopsticks, Clara noted, and took a small contemplative bite. He chewed slowly, his eyes fixed on the center of the table. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, he set his fork down and dabbed his lips with his napkin. He said nothing. The silence that followed was cavernous. Richard's smile faltered. He cleared his throat and launched into his next prepared assault, a barrage of numbers and projections. Our third quarter growth is up 18% year over year. With the integration of your distribution network, we project a 40% increase in market penetration in the APAC region within the first 2 years alone. The synergy is undeniable. The numbers don't lie. Again, Saito delivered a brutally lean translation. The passion, the confidence in Richard's voice was lost. The message received by Tanaka was just a dry recitation of figures, the kind of data he could have read in a prospectus. Tanaka offered a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was impossible to tell if it was acknowledgement agreement or dismissal. Ethan, sensing his boss was floundering, decided to jump in. And the culture at Innovate Dynamics, Mr. Tanaka, it's all about disruption. We're lean, we're agile. We're not afraid to break things to build something better. We move fast. He made a swift chopping motion with his hand, nearly knocking over his water glass. Clara watched as Saito translated this. The words for disruption and break things he chose were harsh, suggesting chaos and disrespect for tradition, not nimble innovation. She saw a flicker of something in Mr. Tanaka's eyes, then a slight narrowing, a tightening at the corners. It was a minuscule reaction, invisible to the Americans, but to Clara, who had learned to read her grandmother's subtle expressions, it was a blaring alarm. The main course arrived, a pan-seared duck breast with a cherry reduction sauce. The conversation had devolved into a desperate monologue by Richard, who was now explaining the technical specifications of their flagship software using acronyms and jargon that were likely meaningless even before being filtered through Saito's clipped translations. Then came the moment the entire dinner pivoted from awkward to catastrophic. In a misguided attempt to build a personal connection, Richard leaned forward conspiratorially. "You know, Mr. Tanaka," he said, lowering his voice. "I did some research. I know your company started from humble beginnings. My grandfather, too, started with nothing but a pushcart in Brooklyn. A real rags-to-riches story. We understand hard work." He then raised his glass. Kanpai he boomed, using one of the few Japanese words he knew, but pronouncing it with a hard, grating accent. Clara felt her stomach clench. It wasn't just the clumsy pronunciation. It was the gross oversimplification, the arrogant assumption of a shared experience. From what she remembered reading in a business journal, the Tanaka Corporation hadn't started from humble beginnings in the American sense. It was born from a family of renowned artisans going back generations who adapted their craft to modern technology. It was a story of legacy and honor, not a rags-to-riches scramble. Saito spoke to Mr. Tanaka. This time his translation was longer. He seemed to be explaining Richard's analogy in detail. As he spoke, Mr. Tanaka's face, once a placid lake, became a sheet of ice. He placed his knife and fork deliberately on his plate, not in the finished position, but parallel, a sign of pause of displeasure. He finally looked directly at Richard, and for the first time his gaze was not empty. It was cold, deeply, profoundly cold. He spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the room's ambient murmur with the sharpness of shattered glass. He uttered 2 short, clipped sentences in Japanese. Saito turned to the Americans, his face an emotionless mask. "Mr. Tanaka says your grandfather's story is noted." The dismissal was absolute. The air went from tense to arctic. The deal was not just stalling, it was dying right there on the pristine white tablecloth of table 12. Olivia put her fork down, a look of quiet resignation on her face. Ethan's face was pale. Richard's jaw was clenched so tight, a muscle pulsed violently in his cheek. From her vantage point, Clara understood the full weight of the exchange. Mr. Tanaka hadn't just dismissed the story. The words he had used were layered with formality and distance. He had essentially drawn a line, creating an impassable gulf between his legacy and Richard's cheap comparison. It was a masterful, devastatingly polite insult, and the Americans were completely oblivious to the artistry of their own execution. They only knew the result, the suffocating final weight of failure. The arrival of dessert, a deconstructed tiramisu, served in a martini glass, did nothing to sweeten the mood. It sat untouched. The energy at the table had curdled. Richard Sterling had fallen silent, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and panic. He was a man accustomed to winning, to bending the world to his will, through sheer force of personality and a loud voice. Confronted with Tanaka's quiet, impenetrable wall, he was utterly neutered. It was then that Mr. Tanaka began to speak again. He wasn't addressing the Americans. His gaze was distant, fixed somewhere beyond the tinted windows, beyond the Manhattan skyline. He spoke softly in Japanese, his tone completely different from before. The cold, sharp formality was gone. In its place was something softer, more wistful. It was a quiet, flowing monologue. Richard looked at Saito, expecting a translation. "What's he saying?" he demanded, his voice a harsh whisper. Saito hesitated for a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his stoic face. He seemed reluctant to translate. "He is making an observation about the season." The season, Ethan squeaked, utterly bewildered. "What about the season?" "It is not relevant to our discussion," Saito said dismissively, a clear signal to drop the subject. But Clara, clearing plates from an adjacent empty table, had stopped breathing. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She recognized it instantly. The cadence, the specific vocabulary, the gentle, rolling consonants. It wasn't the standard, crisp Japanese of Tokyo news broadcasts, or the formal language of business. It was a regional dialect. Specifically, it was the Kansai dialect from the area around Kyoto, the very dialect her grandmother had spoken, a language infused with a more poetic, earthy sensibility. And the words he was speaking were tearing a hole in her professional composure. He wasn't just making an observation about the season. He was speaking of the cherry blossoms. But he was using archaic poetic terms to describe their fleeting nature. He spoke of mono no aware, the poignant, bittersweet awareness of the impermanence of things. He mentioned a garden, a stone lantern covered in moss, and the scent of rain on dry earth. He wasn't talking about business at all. He was painting a picture of his home, of a place that held deep meaning for him. Clara understood everything in a blinding flash of insight. Kenji Tanaka was not an unfeeling corporate robot. He was a man deeply rooted in a culture that the Americans, with their talk of disruption and moving fast, had shown zero respect for. They saw him as a bank vault to be cracked open. They had come prepared with financial data, but had failed to bring an ounce of human understanding. The deal wasn't failing because of a bad quarterly report or a weak proposal. It was failing because of a profound clash of souls. Tanaka felt disrespected, not by a single insult, but by their entire shallow materialistic approach. His monologue was not a sign of dementia or disinterest. It was an expression of profound homesickness and disillusionment. He had crossed an ocean to meet with men who he felt had no soul, and in this gilded cage, surrounded by strangers who wanted his money but not his wisdom, he had retreated to the only place he could find solace, the memory of his grandfather's garden in Kyoto. Mr. Saito's refusal to translate was now clear to Clara. To translate Tanaka's poetic lamentations would be to expose his boss's vulnerability, to reveal the deep emotional core that the American business world would perceive as weakness. Saito was protecting his master's dignity, but in doing so, he was cementing the very misunderstanding that was killing the deal. He was building the wall higher. A reckless, terrifying idea began to form in Clara's mind. It was insane. It would get her fired. It would violate every rule of her job, every protocol of this temple of fine dining. Mr. Peterson, the restaurant's manager, a man with eyes like a hawk and a demeanor to match, was already watching their table with a concerned frown from across the room. Any deviation from perfect invisible service would bring his wrath down upon her. But as she listened to Mr. Tanaka's soft, melancholic Japanese, she heard her grandmother's voice. She heard the stories of a world where beauty was valued as much as strength, where a single perfectly rendered haiku could hold more meaning than a 1,000-page contract. She looked at the faces of the Americans, frustrated, defeated, and utterly blind. Then she looked at the lonely, isolated millionaire, speaking a language of the heart that no one at the table could understand. No one except her. The weight of that knowledge, of that shared secret language, was too heavy to ignore. Her hands, usually so steady, began to tremble slightly as she picked up a tray of empty dessert glasses. The decision she had to make had nothing to do with a billion-dollar merger. It was about a simple, terrifying act of human connection. Seeing the deal slipping through his fingers like sand, Richard Sterling decided on a final, desperate gambit. He reached into his briefcase and produced a long, velvet-covered box. He slid it across the table with a theatrical flourish. The gesture was meant to be one of magnanimous reconciliation, but it came across as a crude bribe. Mr. Tanaka, Richard said, his voice straining to sound smooth and confident. A token of our esteem. A gesture of our commitment to a long and prosperous future together. Ethan leaned over and whispered to Olivia, "It's the new Patek Philippe chronograph. Cost over 100 grand. Mr. Tanaka looked at the box, then at Richard. He did not move to open it. The gift, a symbol of Swiss precision and Western luxury, was the ultimate cultural misstep. To a man like Tanaka, whose own company produced timepieces renowned for their understated elegance and artistic heritage, this flashy, ostentatious offering was not a gesture of respect. It was an insult. It implied his loyalty could be bought with a gaudy trinket. He looked at the box and uttered a single sharp word in Japanese. Saito, his face, grim, translated with brutal accuracy. "It is unnecessary." Then Tanaka followed with a longer, colder sentence, his voice like the snap of a whip. He stood a clear signal that the evening was over. The deal was dead. Saito rose with him. "Mr. Tanaka thanks you for the dinner. He will be in touch." It was the standard, polite brush-off that meant you will never hear from me again. Panic flared in Richard's eyes. "Wait, please," he stammered, but Tanaka had already turned away. It was in that precise moment of unbearable tension that Clara made her move. It wasn't a conscious decision, so much as an instinctual convulsive reaction. As she reached for Olivia's untouched dessert glass, her hand, slick with nervous sweat, faltered. The delicate stem slipped from her grasp. The world seemed to slow down. The martini glass traced a graceful, terrible arc through the air before it met the polished hardwood floor. The sound was not a mere crash. In the super-compressed silence of the room, it was an explosion, a crystalline detonation that shattered the tension and turned every single head in the restaurant toward table 12. Mr. Peterson, the manager, was instantly in motion, his face a thundercloud of fury. "Rossi," he hissed, his voice trembling with rage as he strode toward her. "My office. Now." The American executives stared, momentarily grateful for a distraction from their humiliation. Mr. Saito looked annoyed at the disruption. Mr. Tanaka, who had been halfway to the door, stopped and turned his gaze, falling upon the mess on the floor, and then, for the first time, on the waitress. Clara was mortified, her face burning with shame. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, dropping to her knees to pick up the larger shards of glass, her training kicking in even as her world crumbled. She was going to be fired. After all her hard work, all the sacrifices, she would be jobless because of one clumsy mistake. But as she knelt there, her eyes met Mr. Tanaka's, and in that split second, the insane, reckless idea from before resurfaced, no longer a choice, but a necessity. The dam of her professional restraint broke. Looking directly at the Japanese millionaire, ignoring her furious manager and the bewildered executives, she spoke. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it was clear and unwavering. She began with a formal, deep bow of her head, an apology from the soul. "I'm deeply sorry. It was my carelessness." Then she straightened up slightly, her gaze still holding his, and added a single quiet phrase in the beautiful melodic Kansai dialect of her grandmother. It was a fragment of a poem, a proverb about the beauty of broken things. Even in a shattered mirror, the light can reside. The room fell into a profound, bottomless silence. The words hung in the air, delicate and strange. To the Americans and Mr. Peterson, it was meaningless gibberish. To Mr. Saito, it was a shocking, inexplicable breach of every conceivable protocol. But to Kenji Tanaka, it was a lightning bolt. His cold, impassive mask disintegrated. His eyes, for the first time that night, widened in genuine, unadulterated shock. It wasn't just that she had spoken Japanese. It was what she had spoken. The specific dialect, the poetic, philosophical phrase. It was a key, turning in a lock he thought long rusted shut. It was a phrase his own grandfather, the founder of his company, used to say, when a piece of pottery would break in the kiln. It was a phrase from the heart of his own history. He stared at the kneeling waitress, this invisible girl in a black uniform, and saw not a clumsy servant, but a mystery. A ghost who had just spoken the secret language of his soul. Forgetting his departure, forgetting the billion-dollar deal, forgetting everything. He took a step back toward the table and asked her a single sharp question in the same dialect. "Where did you learn those words?" The exchange between the millionaire and the waitress electrified the air at table 12. Richard Sterling looked back and forth between them, his face a comical mask of confusion and fury. What the hell is going on? What did she say? He demanded of no one in particular. Mr. Peterson, who had been about to physically haul Clara out of the dining room, froze in his tracks, his mouth agape. His employee was not only speaking to a guest, but the guest, the most important guest in the restaurant's recent history, was speaking back. Clara, still on her knees amidst the shards of glass, looked up at Mr. Tanaka. His question, "Where did you learn those words?" echoed in her ears. The fear of being fired was suddenly dwarfed by the awesome, terrifying gravity of the moment. She had his complete, undivided attention. She answered him honestly, her voice still quiet, but gaining a new confidence. "I learned them from my grandmother. She was from Kyoto." A flicker of understanding, of deep recognition, warmed Tanaka's eyes. Kyoto, the home of his ancestors, the home of his heart. He gestured for her to stand, a small, respectful inclination of his head. As she rose, he spoke again, a torrent of questions in the soft dialect. He asked about her grandmother, about her family, about how she came to be here, in a New York restaurant, carrying the words of his grandfather on her lips. A strange and wonderful conversation began flowing around the stunned figures at the table, as if they were stones in a stream. Clara, her years of service forgotten, answered him. She spoke of her grandmother's small apartment in Queens that always smelled of incense, of the stories of the Gion district of the bonsai tree that was her most prized possession. She spoke not as a waitress, but as the granddaughter of a woman from Kyoto. Mr. Saito watched, his professional composure completely shattered. He was a translator, a bridge between two worlds. But this waitress had not just built a bridge. She had revealed a secret passage he never knew existed. He was obsolete, a witness to a form of communication far beyond the scope of his formal training. Olivia Grant leaned forward, utterly captivated. She couldn't understand the words, but she could see the phenomenal shift in the room's dynamics. She saw Kenji Tanaka's entire posture change. The rigid defensive stance melted away, replaced by an engaged, open curiosity. His face was animated, his hands gesturing as he spoke. He was no longer a silent monolith of corporate power. He was a man engaged in a deeply personal and meaningful conversation. "Someone tell me what is happening." Richard finally exploded his patience. Gone. It was Tanaka who answered, though not directly. He stopped his conversation with Clara and turned to the table. For the first time all evening he addressed them, speaking in slow, heavily accented, but perfectly clear English. "This meeting was a test," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying immense weight. "You brought me numbers, projections. You showed me a watch." He gestured dismissively at the velvet box on the table. "You speak of disruption, of breaking things. My company was not built by breaking things. It was built by perfecting them. For 300 years my family made lacquerware. We did not disrupt the tree. We learned its spirit. We did not move fast. We took a lifetime to understand the flow of the resin." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the stunned faces of Richard and Ethan before settling on Olivia, who was listening with rapt attention. "I came here looking for a partner who understands the spirit of creation, the soul in the work. I did not see it in your presentation. I did not hear it in your words." He then turned his gaze to Clara, and a small, genuine smile touched his lips. "Until now?" He looked back at the executives. "This young woman." She dropped a glass. "An accident." But her apology was not just for the glass. She spoke of finding light in what is broken. "That is the soul of my company. To find beauty in imperfection, to respect the process, to understand that true value is not in what a thing costs, but in the story it tells." The revelation landed with the force of a physical blow. They had misunderstood everything from the very foundation. They had been trying to sell a product while he was searching for a philosophy. Tanaka then looked at Clara, a new decisive light in his eyes. He reverted to Japanese, speaking to her directly. "Your grandmother taught you well. Such wisdom is rare. It is more valuable than any software." He then said something that made Clara's eyes go wide with disbelief. He turned to Mr. Saito. "Saito-san, please translate for me now. I wish for there to be no misunderstanding." Saito, humbled and a little shaken, nodded. Tanaka looked at Clara. "I would like to offer you a position at my company." Saito translated, his voice laced with awe. "As a liaison, a consultant for my American operations. Your title will be Chief of Cultural Understanding. Your salary will be commensurate with the immense value you have already provided my corporation tonight." Clara swayed on her feet, steadying herself on the back of a chair. The entire restaurant, her furious manager, the billion-dollar deal, it all faded into a roaring in her ears. A job offer from Kenji Tanaka. Her life, a relentless series of double shifts and mounting bills, had just been irrevocably, unimaginably altered by a dropped glass and a line of poetry her grandmother used to recite while mending a chipped teacup. The remainder of the evening unfolded like a scene from a surrealist film. The power dynamics at table 12 had not just shifted. They had been completely inverted. Richard Sterling, once the confident predator, was now a ghost at his own feast. He sat in stunned, emasculated silence, the expensive watch on the table a monument to his colossal failure of perception. Ethan Hayes looked as if he might be physically ill, his sycophantic nods replaced by a wide-eyed, slack-jawed stare. It was Olivia Grant who rose to the occasion. While the men around her were paralyzed by the collapse of their strategy, she saw the birth of a new one. She saw the opening Tanaka had given them. Ignoring Richard, she leaned forward and spoke not to Tanaka, but to Clara. "Clara," she began, her voice calm and respectful. My name is Olivia Grant. Would you be willing to help us to translate for us? Not just our words, but our intent. We clearly have much to learn." Clara, still reeling from the job offer, looked from Olivia's earnest face to Mr. Tanaka's expectant one. He gave her a slight nod of encouragement. Taking a deep breath, she pulled an empty chair to the table, no longer a waitress, but the most important person in the room. Mr. Peterson, who had been hovering nearby, looking utterly terrified, simply melted back into the shadows, deciding wisely to become invisible. What followed was not a negotiation. It was a re-education. With Clara as the conduit, the conversation was reborn. Olivia didn't talk about market share or Q3 projections. She asked Tanaka, through Clara, about the history of his company. She asked about the lacquerware artisans, about his grandfather's philosophy. She spoke of Innovate Dynamics' own founding principles, not the aggressive jargon Richard spouted, but the genuine desire of its founders to create elegant, intuitive software that felt less like a tool and more like an extension of the user's mind. Clara translated with a nuance and sensitivity that Mr. Saito, for all his formal training, could never have matched. When Olivia spoke of user experience, Clara translated it using Japanese concepts of the art of selfless hospitality, of anticipating another's needs. When Tanaka spoke of the years it took to master a craft, Clara conveyed not just the words, but the deep cultural reverence for patience and dedication. For the first time, the two companies were actually speaking the same language. A framework for a new kind of partnership began to emerge, one based not on a hostile takeover, but on mutual respect and a shared vision of creating products with soul. Richard Sterling could only watch as his junior executive, guided by a waitress, salvaged the deal he had single-handedly destroyed. His career, he knew, would never recover from this night. Olivia's, on the other hand, had just been launched into the stratosphere. As the discussion wound down, Tanaka turned his attention back to Clara. The business was settled for now. This was personal. "My offer stands," he said in English for the benefit of everyone at the table. "You have a rare gift, Miss Rossi. The world has enough people who can speak two languages. It has very few who can understand two hearts." Clara's mind was a whirlwind. Her life was Queens, the BQE, the smell of the subway, the constant, grinding worry about money. Her dreams were small and practical: help her brother graduate, maybe take a real vacation one day, fix the leaky faucet in her bathroom. The world Tanaka was offering her was one of corporate jets boardrooms in Tokyo, a life she couldn't even begin to imagine. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She thought of her grandmother. She thought of how proud she would be. Not because of the money or the title, but because the language and the wisdom she had passed down, a legacy Clara had thought was just a collection of memories, had turned out to be the most valuable thing she possessed. "Mr. Tanaka," Clara said, her voice clear and steady, I would be honored to accept." A genuine warm smile spread across the millionaire's face. He nodded once, a gesture of finality and welcome. The deal for Innovate Dynamics was saved, but for Kenji Tanaka, the real prize of the evening was the discovery he had made a kindred spirit in the most unlikely of places. The American executives departed in a cloud of bewildered silence. Olivia shook Clara's hand with genuine gratitude and awe, promising to be in touch the next morning. Richard Sterling avoided eye contact altogether, shuffling out of the restaurant, a diminished man. Mr. Saito, after a long, respectful bow to both Tanaka and Clara, arranged for his boss's car, and then waited, a silent sentinel by the door. The staff of Aurelia began the quiet, meticulous process of closing down for the night. Tables were cleared, candles were extinguished, and the curated air of the dining room slowly began to relax. Soon only one table remained occupied. Table 12. Mr. Tanaka had asked Clara to stay. "Please," he had said simply, "have some tea with me." So she sat no longer, a waitress in a uniform, but a guest, an equal. A waiter, her own colleague from an hour ago, nervously approached and took their order for 2 pots of Gyokuro tea, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. The vast, opulent room was empty now, a silent theatre after the final act. The city lights of Manhattan glittered outside the windows, a world away from the quiet intimacy that had settled over their table. The billion-dollar deal, the corporate intrigue, it all felt like a distant memory. When the tea arrived, Tanaka poured it himself, observing the formal ritual, with a grace that turned the simple act into a meditation. He handed a small porcelain cup to Clara. "My grandfather would have liked you," he said softly in Japanese, the language feeling more natural, more true between them now. He believed the soul of a person was revealed not in their great ambitions, but in their small gestures, in the way they hold a teacup, in the kindness they show to a stranger. He told her about the garden he had spoken of earlier. It wasn't a memory. It was a real place behind his family home in Kyoto, a place he still went to find peace. He described the exact placement of the moss-covered lantern, the sound of the small bamboo fountain, the way the light filtered through the maple leaves in autumn. He was sharing a piece of his soul with her, a gift far more valuable than the Patek Philippe watch, still sitting abandoned in its velvet box. Clara, in turn, told him more about her grandmother. She described how the old woman had tried to create her own small piece of Japan in the heart of Queens, with a tiny garden on her balcony and a fierce dedication to the old ways. She confessed that for years she had felt a little embarrassed by it, that she had wanted to be more American to fit in. She had not realized until tonight that the world her grandmother had given her was not a cage, but a key. "Your grandmother gave you a great treasure," Tanaka said, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Legacy is not about what we build in steel and glass. It is about the stories we carry, the wisdom we pass on. You carry her story. That is why I understood you and you me." They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, sipping their tea, 2 strangers from opposite ends of the earth, who had found a common language in a shared history. The barrier between Millionaire and Waitress, between Japan and America, had dissolved completely. All that was left were 2 people, a man who had felt lost, and a woman who had just been found. Finally, Mr. Tanaka placed his cup down. "Your new life begins tomorrow, Rossi-san," he said, a formal honorific that was now filled with warmth and respect. "It will be challenging, but I do not think you are easily frightened." Clara looked out at the glittering, endless city. For the first time, it didn't seem like an overwhelming, indifferent metropolis. It seemed like a place full of impossible possibilities. She was frightened, of course, but underneath the fear was a powerful, surging wave of hope. "No," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "I'm not." She had walked into Aurelia that evening as a servant, invisible to the world. She would walk out as the architect of her own destiny, her future as bright and limitless as the city lights reflected in the restaurant's dark, silent windows. The greatest transaction of the night hadn't been about money at all. It had been an exchange of understanding, a deal sealed not with a signature, but with a single shared word. The automated voice on the Q47 bus announced the stop for 34th Avenue with a synthetic, indifferent chirp. For Clara Rossi, the sound was as familiar as her own heartbeat, the rhythm that punctuated the end of 1,000 exhausting shifts. But tonight, it sounded alien, a transmission from a life that was no longer hers. She stepped off the bus and into the humid Queen's night, the air thick with the competing aromas of a nearby pizza parlor and exhaust fumes. The world hadn't changed, but she had been fundamentally remade within it. In her pocket, her fingers found the cool, impossibly smooth edge of a business card. She didn't need to look at it to know what it said. Kenji Tanaka. Below his name, there was no title, just the elegant, minimalist logo of his corporation, a stylized ginkgo leaf. In the other pocket was a simple personal card for Mr. Saito, with a handwritten note on the back, instructing her to call his direct line at 9 a.m. sharp. The walk to her small third-floor walk-up was a dreamlike procession through the landscape of her past. She saw the 24-hour laundromat, where she spent her Tuesday mornings, the corner bodega, where the owner, Manny, always saved her a copy of the Times. Each familiar landmark seemed to be bidding her farewell. An hour ago, she had been discussing the spirit of Monozukuri in a room that cost more per night than her apartment did in a year. Now she was stepping over a crack in the pavement she knew by heart. The sheer whiplash of it all made her feel dizzy, unmoored from reality. Was it all an elaborate, cruel dream? She fumbled for her keys, the metallic jingle a jarringly normal sound in the quiet hallway. Inside her apartment, she didn't turn on the main light, allowing the glow from the streetlights below to filter through the blinds. The space was small but tidy, a testament to her disciplined nature. A worn but comfortable sofa, a small table with 2 chairs, and a bookshelf overflowing with novels she bought second-hand. And in the corner by the window that faced the brick wall of the adjacent building sat the bonsai tree. It was a Japanese black pine, nearly 50 years old, its trunk gnarled and twisted into a shape of beautiful, resilient struggle. It was her grandmother's most precious possession, and now it was hers. She ran her fingers gently over its rough bark. Even in a shattered mirror, the light can reside. Tonight she felt like that shattered mirror, fractured into 1,000 pieces, but somehow miraculously catching the light. The next morning, Clara woke with a jolt, the certainty of the previous night having been replaced by a gnawing, terrified doubt. Imposter syndrome crept in like a fog. Who was she, a waitress from Queens, to be the chief of cultural understanding for a global conglomerate? She didn't have an MBA. She'd never even been on a plane. The confidence she'd felt at that table, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate need to be understood, felt a universe away. But the business cards were still on her nightstand. It was real. Her first call was not to Mr. Sato, but to Mr. Peterson at Aurelia. She needed to sever the ties to her old life before she could begin the new one. "Rossi," he answered, his voice already laced with irritation. "You have a lot of nerve calling this number after the spectacle you made last night. You're fired, in case that wasn't clear." Clara took a deep breath. "I understand, Mr. Peterson. I'm not calling to contest that. I'm calling to formally resign." A derisive snort came through the phone. "You can't quit a job you've already been fired from. Don't waste my time. I'm also resigning from my luncheon shifts." She continued her voice. I just wanted to give you the courtesy of 2 weeks' notice, though I won't be able to work it. I'll be leaving the country." There was a pause. "Leaving the country, running from your debts after breaking a $50 glass, no," Clara said. And for the first time, a small smile touched her lips. "Actually, Mr. Tanaka offered me a job." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. Clara could picture him perfectly, his jaw dropping his face, turning a shade of pale disbelief. "He offered you a job?" Peterson finally managed to say the words, sounding foreign and absurd on his tongue. "Yes, with his company. In Tokyo." She said the words, feeling more real as she spoke them. I wanted to thank you for the opportunity you gave me at Aurelia. It led to unexpected things." She ended the call before he could formulate a response, severing the connection with a satisfying click. It wasn't triumph she felt, but closure. A chapter had ended. At precisely 9 a.m., she dialed Mr. Saito's number. He answered on the first ring. His voice was all business crisp, formal, efficient. He instructed her to meet him at 11 o'clock at the offices of a law firm on Park Avenue. He told her to bring 2 forms of identification and to dress in business attire. The request sent a new wave of panic through her. Her wardrobe consisted of her work uniforms and a collection of jeans and sweaters. After a frantic search, she settled on a simple black dress she'd bought for a wedding years ago, pairing it with her only pair of sensible heels. Staring at her reflection, she felt like a child playing dress-up. But as she walked out the door, she held her head high. This was her new uniform. The law office was a silent, intimidating cathedral of glass and steel. Mr. Saito met her in the lobby and led her to a conference room with a panoramic view of Central Park. He was different from the night before. The impassive wall was back, but there was a new undercurrent of profound respect in his eyes. "Ms. Rossi," he said with a slight bow. "Thank you for coming. Mr. Tanaka has returned to Tokyo, but he left me with explicit instructions." He slid a thick folder across the polished mahogany table. It was an employment contract. Clara opened it, her hands trembling slightly. She scanned the pages of legal jargon, but her eyes caught on the numbers. The salary was a figure she couldn't comprehend, followed by a relocation package, a housing allowance, and a signing bonus that was more than she had ever made in a single year. "This," she stammered, "this is too much." On the contrary, Saito said, his expression serious. "Mr. Tanaka considers it a bargain. He believes your insight saved him from a catastrophic business decision and in the process revealed a more promising path forward. Your value cannot be quantified, but this is the corporation's attempt to do so." He then walked her through her duties. She would not be a mere translator. She would be part of the executive strategy team for all North American ventures. She would be tasked with reviewing marketing materials, advising on corporate culture integration, and acting as a sounding board for Mr. Tanaka himself. "I must be candid, Ms. Rossi Saito," said his gaze direct. "There will be those in the company, both here and in Tokyo, who will be skeptical. They will see your story as a fluke. They will see your lack of a traditional corporate background as a liability. You will have to prove your worth to them, not just once, but every day." Clara listened, the fear and doubt swirling inside her. But Saito's words, intended as a warning, had the opposite effect. They solidified her resolve. She had spent her entire life proving her worth to bosses, to customers, to herself. This was no different, the stakes were just higher. "I understand," she said, her voice firm. "When do I start?" The final piece of business was the phone call she had been waiting to make. That evening, clutching her signed contract, she called her younger brother, Leo. He was a sophomore studying engineering, his tuition the primary engine of her relentless work schedule. "Hey, Clara. Everything okay?" he asked, his voice full of youthful energy. "Everything is different," she said, a laugh bubbling up inside her. "Leo, are you sitting down?" She told him everything. The dinner, Mr. Tanaka, the shattered glass, the poem, the job offer. At first he was silent, and she worried he thought she was joking or had lost her mind. Then a loud whoop erupted from the phone, so loud she had to pull it away from her ear. "Are you serious, Clara? Are you serious, Tokyo? A chief of something holy? Clara." His joy was pure and uncontainable, a chaotic explosion of happiness that washed away the last of her doubts. "And Leo," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "you don't have to worry about the student loans anymore, or the part-time job. I want you to just focus on your studies. I've got it covered." The sob that came from her brother's end of the line was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of a burden being lifted. It was the sound of their shared struggle finally ending. In that moment, all the years of sore feet, of missed holidays, of scrimping and saving it all became worth it. Later that night, Clara stood before the bonsai tree once more. The apartment was quiet. The contract lay on the table, a stark white rectangle, promising a future she had never dared to dream of. She gently misted the pine's needles with water, her movements slow and deliberate, just as her grandmother had taught her. The tree had survived for 50 years by adapting, by drawing strength from its roots, while bending to the forces that shaped it. She looked out her window, past the brick wall, past the familiar skyline of Queens, and imagined the horizon far beyond. For the first time, she wasn't just looking at the end of a borough. She was looking east towards the rising sun. Her journey was just beginning. The story of Clara and Mr. Tanaka isn't just about a billion-dollar deal or a lucky break. It's a powerful reminder that in our hyper-connected, data-driven world, the most crucial element of communication is often the one we overlook: genuine human understanding. The executives at that table had all the right numbers, but they failed because they couldn't speak the language of respect, of legacy, of the heart. It took a waitress, someone they had deemed invisible, to show them that the key to connection isn't always found in a boardroom, but in the quiet wisdom we inherit and the courage to share it. It proves that sometimes the most powerful voice in the room is the one nobody expects to hear. If this story reminds you that everyone has a hidden depth and a unique story to tell, please hit that like button, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more true life stories that reveal the extraordinary in the ordinary.